Ekalaka is the second oldest settlement in southeastern Montana. Miles City came into being in 1877 and Ekalaka in 1883. Well, the early years it was pretty much cowboys and buffalo hunters, and then as the town grew, everybody was interested in horses, so they formed sort of a racing association, and they developed a track on the western side of Ekalaka, and they had race meets. Well, then in later years they started riding bucking horses. Then it developed into a rodeo, and most of the top cowboys from that era, Bob Askin and Paddy Ryan and Howard Teglin, they're all in the Cowboy Hall of Fame. They rode here, and Florence Whitney. And then in 1935, the town fathers decided that they would have a golden jubilee to celebrate 50 years of Ekalaka's existence. Well, they called it Days 85, and that's been known as the Days 85 ever since. Well, my granddad Earl settled about 13 miles west of Ekalaka in 1913, and there were 6 sons: Frank, Fay, Chandler, known as Feek, Red, Dick, and Bill, and they put on a rodeo in 1931 at the ranch. That was the first rodeo, and so they branched out from there. They had rodeos in Miles City and Baker and Ekalaka, Deadwood, Belfou, South Dakota, Dickinson, Hettinger, and Bowman, North Dakota. They also took horses to Chicago, and that's how the Tooke brothers got started in the rodeo business, furnishing bucking horses. And at the time they got started, there were thousands of loose horses around here. The homesteaders had started leaving. They'd abandoned their horses, and then the ranches and farms, homesteads that were still in business had a lot of extra horses. They were unbroke and spoiled, and so there were horses everywhere to pick from as far as bucking horses. And anyway, Dad was the horseman. He was behind the rodeo part, and he could see a time in the future when these rodeo prospects would dry up. So he decided that he'd start raising some bucking horses. Pat O'Kane was a foreman down on Powder River, and the Powder River Badlands are tough on saddle horses, so he was going to breed a type of horse that could stand up to that hard use, and he crossed a Shire stud to some thoroughbred mares, and he got up with the right type of a horse. They were big and they were agile, but they had a terrible disposition. All they wanted to do was buck. And only Bob Askin or somebody like that could handle them. So Dad could see that, by crossing a big draft stud, Shire probably, to thoroughbred mares, that you could raise bucking horses. So he bought horses here and there, and then in 1943 he shipped a registered Shire stallion in from Iowa. He was 3 years old, weighed a ton, and magnificent animal. And so he's really going to raise work horses and maybe bucking horses out of this King Larrygo. That was the horse's name, and it just didn't work out like Dad thought. The horse got kicked and ruined the first thing, and he only got one colt. And that was all they got out of this high-powered, high-priced stud they'd shipped in by rail. But the horse he called Prince was out of a Shire mare he'd picked up somewhere that was raunchy, and so Prince was the foundation to the bucking horse breed. They called Dad the Henry Ford of the bucking horse business. Well, anyway, he started with Prince. Well, then Prince sired General Custer and Grey Wolf and Timberline, and a roan stud that he sold to Casey Tibbs that went to California. But from that line of horses, the PRCA figures there's been more than 6,000 bucking horses that go back to that line. And Sheep Mountain was the first horse bred and raised to be a bucking horse. He was the NFR champion in 1967. And then in 1968, Majorino got it, and he got it in 69. And up until then, why these skeptics said you can't raise a bucking horse, well, we knew what we could do, because we had horses 10, 15 years old that were throwing world champions off. So then they decided that maybe they'd start raising bucking horses, because by then they had run out of bucking horses. In the 1960s, the bucking horses were small and they didn't buck, and there wasn't any well, there just wasn't any horses around other than a few spoiled saddle horses. So in 1970, the Calgary Stampede came down and they bought a load of horses, and then we'd sold the stud to Casey Tibbs. And Irv Corco bought some horses, and Harry Vold, and it kind of spread out from there. And well, let's see, I suppose over the years we sent 125 to Calgary. Last year they retired Graded Coconut. He tied for the most honors. He was the bareback horse of the year 6 times. And before that, Commotion in Oklahoma was the bareback horse of the year 3 times. And Bobby Joe was the saddle bronc of the year 3 times. And it really started in '87 when Cloud Gray and Challenger tied for Bucking Horse of the Year, PRCA, and their uncle Gildy Cat was the runner-up bareback horse. Well, since then, there hasn't been a year that there hasn't been a horse or more than one with that bloodline that won some major championships awards. And anyway, like Clem McSpadden said back in '81, we were down at the national finals and opened it up one ceremony, and he said if it would have been for Pete Tooke and his studs, that we wouldn't have any horses. And in 2008, they elected Pete Tooke into the Pro Rodeo Hall of Fame and the Cowboy Hall of Fame the same year, and he's one of only 4 people to receive that award in the same year. So those horses, Dad used to look at a colt and he'd say, well, now this horse is going to make history, or that horse will make history, and he had no idea. Well, no, he knew what he could do, but you know, for that many horses to get scattered around, more than 6,000, and not just horses, but the elite of the rodeo world, and you can pick them out of anybody's herd the way they're built. Yep. They're bigger and bigger framed, and they got a lot of mane and tail and feathered legs and maybe a head about that long with a Roman nose. Yep. And a glass eye, and they tried to break them to work, and some of the better looking horses they tried to break to ride, and it just didn't work. The more they messed with them, the worse they got. All they wanted to do was buck. But I suppose of all of the studs, the most famous would have been General Guster. He weighed about 1,800 pounds. I don't know, he stood up. I couldn't look over his back. He stood up pretty tall. But I've described him as, in humanistic terms, as a Shaquille O'Neal with the disposition of a Mike Tyson. He was nothing to fool around with. Most big horses are kind of clumsy, but he wasn't. He was really athletic, and anything would make him mad. He'd get to fight in the chute, and if we could get him out without him getting stirred up, it was scary, because he'd jump that high off the ground and then he'd kick right straight up in the air. One of the highest kicking horses I've ever seen. And then as far as the big horse, they usually just kind of kick out behind, but boy, he'd kick right up in there, and then he'd drive those feet in the ground. And he was just too big and too strong, but if he got to fighting in the chute, he'd wear himself out, and then he didn't buck much. But he'd run over your foot, he'd run over your horseback, and he passed that on to all of his descendants. And like Gray Wolf was a great bucking horse, but he wasn't treacherous to be around. You know, you could handle him. But he threw Jim Tesher off at a bronc riding match, and Jim hadn't been on the ground in 3 years. So when he had his mind on bucking, he was tough. And then Timberline, we bucked him bareback. He weighed about 1,300 pounds. But he had a freak way of bucking. He'd lunge way up in the air, and then he'd drop his front end, and he'd kick straight out behind, and he'd just snap those guys over the front. So that was the line of Shires, and then he had a man-eating Arabian that he got from Mark Barrow. Arabians are, you know, they're hot-blooded, but they're gentle. Well, he wasn't. He'd eat you alive. When Dad got the horse from Mark, I went with Dad, and they had him loaded in the truck, and he's broke to ride, and he's trying to kick the side out of the rack. I wondered, what kind of a saddle horse is this? And Mark had told Dad, he said, I'm going to have to deal you that horse before he kills somebody, because he was always getting with the neighbors' horses and tearing stuff up, and they'd get colts that had a lot of colors that they couldn't get in the corral with. So when we had the horse loaded, Mark was talking to Dad, and he said, you can lead that horse anywhere with a piece of string, but don't try to walk up to him. Well, Dad got him home, and he was going to do something, so he roped him, and started up the rope. Well, Snowflake just stood there. Well, then when he got within range, he found out that Mark knew what he was talking about. And I remember he had him in the barn one day pulling his tail, and I thought he was going to kick the side out of the barn. He didn't like that. But he was solid white, and he had a glass eye and 2 red ears and then some red on his rump. And his colts had a lot of color, and Snowflake's been dead for probably 50 years, but we have colts out there that they still have the color. The scoring system is 1 to 25 for a rider and 1 to 25 for the animal on both sides, and 100 points is perfect. And you know, the harder the horse bucks, if the guy can ride him, why, the higher he's going to score. But some of those horses, well, like General Guster and Indian Sign and them, on a good day they were too much horse. But a good score, well, if a horse or a bull scores, say, 20 or 22 points, that's a pretty good score. It should put you in the money if you do any kind of a job of riding. At 85, that's a pretty good score. Average score, an average horse would be about 16 points, and maybe 16 for the rider, which would be about 64 points. Well, that's just sort of average. And then you go from there. So it's important to draw something that can buck, that you can ride if you're going to get into money. Well, it got to the point where they didn't really care that much about getting on them. Mel Potter and Jack Brainerd started rodeo outfit back in, well, they were from Madison, Wisconsin. This was in 65, and they'd picked up horses around here and there and had a lot of rodeos and had a lot of cowboys, but their horses didn't buck much, so they come out here and got 20 head of horses, and they were just going to use them. Well, we sent what we figured was the A-team back there, and the first rodeo they went to, they had all these riders. Well, they almost killed those kids. Well, the next rodeo they went to, they didn't have quite as many. In the third rodeo, they had to pay guys to get on. But Sunset Strip was in that bunch, and at one time he'd bucked 24 bronc riders off in a row. And Bald Hornet was a bareback horse. We bucked him 7 years and got him rode 4 times, and that was in the mud. So those guys found out what it was like to be a bronc rider, and then after that, well, they got horses every year until they finally quit rodeoing. But those horses are scattered from Florida to California to Canada and all points in between. Well, we had one we called Indian Sign, and he's the most terrible bucking horse I'd ever seen. And he bucked so hard he finally killed himself in St. Paul, Minnesota. And the bronc riders, they were scared of him because he'd go out about, maybe 10 or 15 feet, and then he'd just almost rear over backward, and then he'd come down and he'd spin and he'd go like this and suck. But he did things the horse can't do and stay in his hide. And the bronc riders really got stirred up. Well, they outlawed him in the bronc riding, so he just had to buck him bareback. But he was terrible. Boy, that horse, I've never seen anything like him. He was a strawberry roan pinto, and he had a head about like that, and a Roman nose and a glass eye, and you could tell by looking at him that he was a bucking horse, and he was. But he ruptured a blood vessel in St. Paul and bled to death internally, and that was it. He's buried back there at Rochester, Minnesota. Yeah, we've got about, I don't know, 30 head out there, I suppose. I've got one that's running with my saddle horses, has been for 3 years. He got orphaned when he was a colt. The mare had West Nile, and he's a real nice horse. He's pretty quiet, he's big, but I finally got him to where I can hold my hand out like that with oats and he'll eat. But he won't let me put my hands on him. He just kind of backs away and lays an ear back, and
he's got that blood.
He's got that in his background all the way back on both sides. Guster and Snowflake both. Got some people in Colorado that are interested in getting him for a stud. They've had horses for years, and it would be foolish to, to buck him, because we know what he can do, and we've lost horses, in rodeo accidents, break a leg, or and it wouldn't be worth the risk on crippling him up with his background, because he's irreplaceable because the mare is gone. But there's about 30 head running around out there if I could get them all together. Well, I guess we'll always have horses.
Well, that's good. That's good.